Good evening, everyone. We're going to get to our program. Feel free to continue noshing, get a drink, relax. We have a really great program for you this evening. But first, a few remarks. Good evening, distinguished guests, fellow policy practitioners, colleagues, supporters, and speakers at the Middle East Forum's third annual policy conference. My name is Gregg Roman, Executive Director of the organization, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our event and to Washington, D.C. For over 3 decades, the Middle East Forum has remained steadfast in its commitment to promoting American interests through sound policy analysis and informed debate on Middle Eastern affairs. More recently, we have taken the analysis that we put forward and operationalized it for the benefit of the American people and for those who ally with us in the region. Today, we gather at a particularly consequential moment in regional and global history, when the decisions made in Jerusalem, Cairo, Riyadh, and Washington and beyond will reverberate for generations to come. The Middle East continues to present both unprecedented challenges and remarkable opportunities, whether decisions are made at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, in the Prime Minister's compound in Israel, or in a royal palace in the Gulf. From the evolving dynamics of regional security arrangements to the transformation in energy markets, from questions of democratic governance to the enduring pursuit of peace and stability. The policy choices we examine today, tomorrow, and Wednesday, and for those of you who actually want to experience policy making at the War Games on Thursday, and Liron will correct me if I'm wrong, but we might have still a few more spaces. I think Ayatollah, the Putin, MBS are already taken. We might have a few positions in the cabinet that are still available. The policy choices we examine today will shape the trajectory of American engagement in this vital region for the rest of the year and for years to come. The conference brings together some of the most insightful voices in Middle East policy in a discussion around Islamism, former government officials, distinguished academics, ambassadors from the Washington Diplomatic Corps, seasoned diplomats, and engaging thought leaders. Over the next 2 days, we will engage in substantive discussions that bridge the gap between scholarly analysis and practical policymaking. Our panelists will examine critical issues through multiple lenses, ensuring that our deliberations reflect the complexity and nuance these challenging times demand. The Middle East Forum has always believed that robust debate, grounded in rigorous research and informed by real-world experience from on the ground in the region, produces the strongest policy recommendations and also the strongest action that we take as supporters and members of the organization. These discussions will embody that principle, fostering dialogue that is both intellectually honest and policy relevant. I encourage each of you to participate in our sessions, to challenge assumptions respectfully, and to seek common ground where possible. The questions we address here matter not only for academic discourse, for policy discourse, for what happens in the region, but for the millions of lives across the Middle East and for America's role in advancing stability and prosperity in the region. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome Daniel Pipes to the stage to introduce our first speaker.
You may have noticed that while the organization has been around for 3 decades, this is our 3rd annual conference. And that's because it was Gregg who came up with this idea and who implemented it, not me. So I've been getting thanks and congratulations, but direct them to him. It is a pleasure to kick off this evening's 3 talks with an introduction for Joshua Hammer, who will be discussing his new book called Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. He is a senior editor at large at Newsweek, where he hosts the Josh Hammer Show, a podcast and syndicated radio program. He is a constitutional attorney, a syndicated columnist, and a fellow at the national conservative organization, the Edmund Burke Foundation. He brings a principled voice to today's most pressing cultural and geopolitical debates. His work has appeared everywhere, from the New York Post to the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. He's a graduate of Duke University and the University of Chicago Law School. He is the co-founder of Jews Against Soros. A grassroots initiative challenging the influence of leftists who seek to destabilize Western democracies. Mr. Hammer defends Israel not only on moral and ethical grounds, but as a bulwark in the broader defense of Western civilization, its values, stability, and future. That is the topic of his recent book, and it is also the topic of his talk this evening. Please join me in welcoming Josh Hammer.
Well, you know, the funny thing about being a co-founder of Jews Against Soros, Dr. Pipes, is that you didn't mention the other co-founder, which is actually a guy by the name of Will Scharf. I don't know if any of you know Will Scharf. Will is the current staff secretary in the White House. So literally when you see President Trump signing those executive orders, the balding late 30s Jewish guy who's handing him the executive order to actually sign is my good friend Will Scharf, who's my co-founder of Jews Against Soros. So all that's to say that Jews Against Soros reaches to the high levels of the White House, as the case may be. But thank you so much, Dr. Pipes, and to my good friend Gregg Roman for this extraordinarily generous invitation. It's a thrill to be here. I've been a fan of this organization for a very long time now. You know, I thought I would start just with a very brief anecdote involving the aforementioned good friend Gregg Roman. So Gregg and I reconnected on a trip to Armenia, of all countries, about 2 years ago now. It was June 2023. This is a junket of sorts, you might say. Actually, Armin, right here of Tablet Magazine, Armin was on that same junket. Sponsored by a wonderful organization called the Philos Project, which does outreach to Christians when it comes to the Near East and the Middle East. And at the time, the big issues were the Russia-Ukraine war, always thinking about China. I think a lot about China. And I distinctly remember walking around the Soviet-addled streets to this day of Yerevan. And Gregg Roman kind of turned to me and just saying, you know, no one talks about Islamism anymore. No one talks about Hamas, the Brotherhood. No one talks about radical Islamic jihad. And again, mark your calendars. This was June 2023. And, dare I say, Gregg, you were, for better or for worse, extraordinarily prescient, because the world changed, of course, as we know, on October 7, 2023, not less than 4 months after our trip to Yerevan. So I wrote this book, which some of you I see have in your hands, Israel and Civilization, the Fate of the Jewish Nation, the Destiny of the West. I wrote this book not in response necessarily to the horrific pogrom of October 7th itself, but really to the world's reaction to October 7th. The world had a moment there where it could have clearly seen this stark dichotomy between this 7th century Islamist medieval death cult on the one hand and this free, flourishing beacon of all that is true, good, and beautiful on the other hand. The original people of the book, the Bible, joy, prosperity, happiness, simcha. I mean, all the things that decent human beings actually appreciate. And the world seemed at best starkly confused as to which to side with. At worst, it made a definitive choice to side with the wrong decision. We saw that, for instance, in the 30-plus Harvard student groups that infamously blamed the Jews for their own Nazi-esque genocide, not 36 to 48 hours while the blood was still drying and so forth there. So this book that I wrote, the word Israel is something of a double entendre of sorts, where it does, of course, refer to the state of Israel, but also very much refers to the children of Israel and the nation of Israel as well. So I thought I would just talk on those themes just for a few minutes there, and then I do want to just spend at least a few minutes of my limited time just talking about contemporary foreign policy debates and all that is really transpiring out there, because I'm really quite fired up about it, to be honest with you, and I can't not talk about it. But let's talk about kind of the philosophical stuff, and then we'll weave our way into that there. So it's often been said since October 7th that Western civilization is at a crossroads, and I wholly accept the premise, but as a lawyer, Dr. Pipes mentioned my legal background, I like to define terms. Like, what are we talking about here? We're saying Western civilization is at a crossroads. Well, what is Western civilization? Well, I mean, we really ought to ask the question, shouldn't we? So there's the famous Straussian formulation, maybe less famous depending on your level of nerd familiarity with Western political philosophy. But Leo Strauss, the 20th century University of Chicago political scientist, famously describes Western civilization as essentially a DNA strand-like double helix of sorts, you might call it, between reason and revelation, between Greece, Athens, Greco-Roman reason, and Jerusalem, divine revelation essentially there. I don't necessarily reject this conception of it, but I would argue that contemporary society has tended to give the revelation part of this equation an entirely short shrift. And I think that reason has tended to kind of be exalted in many ways above revelation there. But really, if you look at, and I speak, of course, as an American, if you look at the founding of America in many ways, the American framers, our founding fathers, understood this quite particularly well, actually. Look at the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, where the Middle East Forum is based. The Liberty Bell does not have Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics inscribed on the outside of the Liberty Bell. I say that as a fan of Aristotle. Josh Hammer is not anti-Aristotle. I happen to be a fan. But I can't help but note, that it is Leviticus chapter 25, thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. That is proclaimed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia to this day. I note additionally that Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin proposed the national seal of the United States not to be Socrates teaching Plato in the academy, not to be Cicero speaking on the floor of the Roman Senate, but they proposed the national seal of the United States to be Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, parting the Red Sea with the Israelites there. This story, the story of the Israelites, the story of the Torah, of the Old Testament there, was ingrained in the conscience of the American founders. Dare I say that it has been ingrained in the entire history of these United States. Abraham Lincoln, for instance, speaking in February 1861 in Trenton, New Jersey, just a couple months before the infamous first shots were fired on Fort Sumter, famously describes America as an almost chosen people, using this covenantal language. I actually was reading a really neat essay just a few days ago, actually. This essay from a forthcoming book edited by Rabbi Stu Halpern of Yeshiva University, talking about how Lincoln's second inaugural address, actually, which is a very pithy speech, about 700 words in length, has multiple biblical references in every line. It is the most biblical, scriptural heavy of any speech that a statesman has probably ever given in American history there. But there's an incredible story about Lincoln. I want to just read you the anecdote, but I have to rely on my notes here because it's just too good not to get the details correctly there. So there's this one situation where General Grant issues an affirmatively anti-Semitic edict in his army, somewhere in the Midwest, in Illinois, Indiana. Some of you are nodding your heads. You've heard this tale, but I will tell it for the rest of you who have not been so privileged to hear it. And this edict from General Grant essentially kicks the Jews out of the military unit. No Jews, you can't be here. So the Jewish soldiers, led by a man named Caskell, who are offended by this, they take umbrage, as they should, to this grossly anti-Semitic decree. They ride their horse and buggies, trains, to Washington, D.C., and they end up getting a face-to-face sit-down with Abraham Lincoln. The time was a little different. You could kind of just stride it here and get your face-to-face sit-down with a wartime commander-in-chief. So the alleged interaction goes as follows. Abraham Lincoln says to the soldiers led by this man Caskell, "And so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan?" Caskell says, "Yes, and that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom seeking protection." Lincoln says, "And this protection they shall have at once." In reality, it actually goes back even quite a bit further than that. During the sailing of the Mayflower, literally the sailing of the Mayflower in the early 17th century, the captain of the Mayflower, the history buffs will recall, was an Englishman by the name of Sir William Bradford. He ends up becoming the second governor of Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts when the boat lands. Sir William Bradford was himself a student back in England of a well-known English Hebraist, kind of an old-school term, but referring to a scholar of the Hebrews, of their language, the culture, the scripture, and so forth there. And Bradford actually spoke about 1,000 words of Hebrew from his learning under Sir William Henry Ainsworth, excuse me. And there was actually chatter on the Mayflower itself about possibly issuing a clean break and cutting all ties with the English language, and then just speaking Hebrew when they landed in Plymouth Colony there. It didn't happen, of course, although that conversation, believe it or not, was actually resuscitated in the 1780s after the independence from Britain, after the Treaty of Paris. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, they spoke about it a little bit, and never caught off at either juncture there. One final anecdote about the Mayflower story, though. When the Mayflower actually lands at Plymouth Rock, Sir William Bradford famously, this is actually the literal origin of the Thanksgiving holiday today. Sir William Bradford lands there in Plymouth, Massachusetts there, and he famously gets down on his knees and he prostrates himself before the Creator. Many scholars think, although this is debated, I'm not pretending like this is a unanimous opinion among the scholars and historians, but there are some who think that in successfully finishing a voyage over water, this student of Hebraism was essentially mimicking Birkat HaGomel, which is the Thanksgiving prayer that observant Jews say with a minyan, among other instances when you successfully complete a voyage over water. So, the next time that you're eating turkey watching the Dallas Cowboys probably lose a football game, think about the fact that maybe this literally comes from Sir William Bradford there at Plymouth. So all of that are kind of the themes of the earlier book there. Just a very, very quick word in my remaining couple of minutes, though, about all of this on the contemporary foreign policy stage. It is true on the one hand that, as John Quincy Adams said in 1821 when he was Secretary of State, he wasn't quite president yet, he famously said that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. I'm paraphrasing here, she is the well-wisher of everyone's liberty but a guarantor only of her own. I accept that because I am a nationalist and a realist when it comes to foreign policy matters. It is also true that there's increasingly a loud and vocal band of incredibly just wildly misguided ingrates who are now taken to besmirching anyone who disagrees with their doctrinaire, Charles Lindbergh, Ron Paul positions as quote-unquote neocons. And I have to say to them, and excuse me, Dr. Pipes, this is a little impolitic here, but screw you. Like, I'm sorry, but just screw you. Because there 1,000% is an America First case for engaging in the Middle East. There is 1,000% an America First case for having close ties with the State of Israel, a country that takes out terrorists like Yahya Sinwar, Hassan Nasrallah, who takes out jihadis and Hezbollah like Fuad Shakor and Ibrahim Akil, jihadis who had a $5 and $7 million U.S. State Department bounty, respectively, on their head before the IDF did the dirty work that the U.S. Armed Forces couldn't do for 40-plus years. Are you freaking kidding me? Are you kidding me right now? There's not an America First case for this alliance. I can't believe the stuff that I'm hearing right now. It makes a little more sense when you consider the Qatari money that's flowing around, I guess, to influence some of these talking points. But it's really just reprehensible stuff. And I think that is incumbent on the people in this room to kind of just say enough already. Enough already. We are America Firsters. We love our country, the United States there. We think and we know that America is better off, the West is better off when we know what we stand for. We stand for the Bible, the original people of the book, the Jewish people, the great Gentile offshoot, the Christians. We know what we stand for there, and Israel is the West's canary in the coal mine. It always has been, it always will be. Thank you very much.